Welcome to Brown Bag History for September 14th, 2022. We're just getting started on our new fall season. And today we're going to be talking about the Rogers Pass Highway. It's the 60th anniversary of the construction of the highway. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snuneymuxw territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So, as I mentioned, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the opening of the Rogers Pass Highway, really a game changer for this region. In 1922, the first highway opened to the west of Revelstoke. It went to Sicamous, and then there were highway links beyond Sicamous into the Okanagan and to the coast. But you still couldn't travel east at that point. In 1927, there was a discussion on a highway connecting Golden and Revelstoke, and they were looking at potential routes. At that point, it said that a potential route through Rogers Pass was strongly opposed by the National Parks Association. And the eventual route of that first highway between Revelstoke and Golden was called the Big Bend Highway. And it basically followed the bend of the Columbia River from Golden to Revelstoke. So it was a very long, winding road, and it was generally only open between May and the end of October. They couldn't keep it plowed. So it was, so even after 1940, when the highway officially opened, there was still not really good road access between Revelstoke and Golden for part of the year. So it really made it difficult for transporting of goods. There was a lot of shipping companies that were having to use routes into the United States to get their goods east. So there was really a need expressed for a modern highway through this region. There was a railway strike in 1950, and it really made it apparent the lack of a good highway linkage in the area. There was an editorial in the Vancouver Daily Province that said that said in these days of aerial bombing, no nation can ever be sure that its railways will be safe in case of war. It is therefore imperative that there be alternative transport routes. Canada's two transcontinental railways are vulnerable, and we should by all means have a highway that can be used if for any reason the railway service is interrupted. The value of such a highway to certain sections of this country was aptly demonstrated during the recent railway strike. So there were discussions right away about a new highway route. The local MLA, A.W. Lundell, was asking for a survey to be made for a direct route for the Trans-Canada Highway through Glacier National Park. And so they were discussing that quite early on. And so they did begin surveys of Rogers Pass in the early 1950s. We have a document called The Selection of the Trans-Canada Highway Route Through the Selkirk Mountains by J.P. Haig, Senior Location Engineer, Department of Highways, BC. And he presented this as a paper in June of 1957. And he said that the Provincial Department of Highways undertook investigations of all possible highway routes through the Selkirks, including upgrading of the Big Bend Highway. They decided that upgrading the Big Bend Highway wasn't feasible, partly because of its length, 196 miles. And even at that time, they were discussing the potential construction of the Mica Dam. So they realized that if they upgraded the highway through the Big Bend Highway, there was the potential that within a few years they would have to rebuild vast sections of it because of a dam reservoir. They did look at other potential passes through the Selkirks. There was a route through the Illecillewaet River, Tangier Creek, and Mountain Creek to Beavermouth. Appeared feasible, and that was investigated, but it proved to be economically impractical to construct and maintain a safe all-weather highway through that area. So a full reconnaissance survey of Rogers Pass was carried out during the summer of 1953. The route of 88 miles was deemed feasible, and location surveys were also carried out during 1955 and 1956 by the federal government as well. It was clear, obviously, right from the beginning that this was going to be a joint venture between the provincial and the federal government, because big sections of the highway were going through the national parks, Glacier and Mount Revelstoke National Parks. So on July 5th, 1956, the Rogers Pass was chosen as the route of the Trans-Canada Highway. Again, there'd been discussion on other routes. One of the other routes looked at was Jumbo Pass, which was through south of Golden. But that was seen as not feasible. There was a note at the time that the Rogers Pass was noted that said advocates of the Jumbo Pass route, regarded as a highly impractical alternative by most engineers, have been doing everything in their power to discredit the Rogers Pass route. However, federal and provincial authorities have not been stampeded by such propaganda. So the route was announced by BC Highways Minister Phil A. Ghilardi in Vancouver. The cost was estimated at $22 million. You'll hear at the end of the talk how badly they were out of whack in that term, in that figure, to build the 88 miles between Revelstoke and Golden. So on July 7th, 1957, the first big Rogers Pass contract was let. The Federal Public Works Department awarded 2 contracts totaling over $1,000 to Mannix Limited of Calgary for clearing and grubbing 20 miles of the new route through Rogers Pass. The target date for the opening of the paved 2-lane highway was the end of December 1960. They didn't meet that target. They were expecting that the summer seasons of 1958 and 59 would be devoted to grading of the route, with final paving to be done in 1960. And there was blasting at Albert Canyon for road construction in 1958. It mentioned that foresight to the extent of 5,626 pounds of 40% was used. The amount of rock blasted was 6,000 cubic yards. There was a lot of anticipation for the new highway. There was a business writer business writer named James Rowe, who said they saw a bright future for Revelstoke when the Trans-Canada Highway is complete. Said Mayor Walter Hardman predicts that the city's present population of about 4,000 will increase to around 40,000 in the next 20 years. Development of the area as a tourist and holiday mecca is only part of it. But today, Revelstoke is still just an attractive, sedate railway town. Mayor Hardman was obviously off by quite a bit. We've never reached 40,000, although our census population of 8,000 is quite low when you look at the winter tourism that we get here and the people that are living here over the winter season. One of the big aspects of building a highway through the Rogers Pass was considering the avalanche control. It's still a major factor in the operation of the Rogers Pass Highway, and they put a lot of effort into planning for the avalanche control. They started doing snow surveys in the winter of 1953 to 1954, and that's even before the route had been formally selected. And then, of course, once they did select the route, they accelerated that work. A lot of the survey work was under the personal direction of Noel Gardner, who was an authority on snow conditions. He'd been a park warden in Banff and Glacier Parks for 20 years. And in the 1950s, they established a permanent base for snow research at Glacier, with observation posts located high in the mountains. One was at Mount Abbott, an elevation of 7,000 feet. They also had a Mount Fidelity weather station. And here's a picture of Noel Gardner's back with a specially designed backpack kit that he used for his work measuring the snow and measuring the conditions. There's even a little scale there for measuring, for weighing the snow. So they developed a lot of tools to undertake those tasks. And what they were looking at was exactly what they're doing now. It said studies indicate that an experienced crew attached to the maintenance group after completion of the highway will be able to closely predict when hazards exist. So the road can be closed to bring the slides down by explosives or mortar fire. And that's exactly what the present day avalanche control program consists of. Here's one of the research stations high in the mountains, the Mount Fidelity Research Station. In 1957, Peter Scherer came to Rogers Pass. He was born in Switzerland in 1926, and he just passed away earlier this year. But he was trained as a civil engineer, and he came to Canada under the auspices of the National Research Council of Canada to study and develop the avalanche control program at Rogers Pass. He arrived in the pass on April 3rd, 1957, and this picture was taken just after his arrival. He is observing the incline of a slide path, and the instrument that he's using is now in our Land of Thunder and Snow exhibit in the museum. He was really remarkable. You know, he really did. He was the one that was responsible for where the snow sheds are placed now, for developing the program with the military where they shoot down the avalanches. He was really at the forefront of doing all of that, and working with Noel Gardner, who had been doing all of this study. They were able to come up with this really accurate plan of how to mitigate the avalanche risk in Rogers Pass. He had took copious notes. We've got all these photographs that were taken during his work, and well annotated. This is just a few pages of his journals. The Weather Observatory at Mount Abbott in 1956. And one of the things that they developed that wasn't proved to be not quite as effective as some of the other methods, but they would create these mounds of dirt that were, the idea was that it would sort of disperse the avalanches rather than them going right onto the highway. So they put a lot of effort into developing the artillery program for shooting down the avalanches. And here's, you can see these detailed drawings where they're figuring out the targets, and these are like specific shots that they did on those targets and the result of the slides that happened. By 1961, the program was in full swing. Major General Jeffrey Walsh, General Officer of the Western Command, spent some time in Glacier National Park visiting the No. 2 Regiment Royal Canadian Horse Artillery based in Winnipeg. And they were had a 2-month tour of duty in the avalanche control in Glacier National Park. That was February of 1961. So the general witnessed a stabilizing shot from the 105 howitzer gun at Illecillewaet. and a one from the 75 howitzer at Rogers Pass. The superintendent of Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks, B.R. Stiles, accompanied the general on his inspection. And it mentioned in the paper that No. 2 Squadron is credited with having brought down several avalanches this winter. And that is continues, that program continues. It's called Operation Palachi now, and it's the longest running operation in the Canadian military history. And then, of course, the building of the snow sheds and the design of the snow sheds and location of the snow sheds was a big part of the work that Peter Scherer was in charge of. So we have several photographs of the construction of the sheds. This is the Lanark shed under construction in 1960. In 1961, they were still building some of the snow sheds. There was a note in the paper that Dawson Wade and Company Limited and Peter Kiewit Sons Canada Company of Canada combined to submit the low tender for the construction of snow sheds on the Trans-Canada Highway. The bid of $805,881 was for the Lenz and Tupper No. 3 snow sheds. And then in July of 1961, the last contract on the highway was let to John Lang and Son Limited for 2 snow sheds near Illecillewaet, and the contract was for $990,000 for 2 sheds, one 616 feet long and another 460 feet long. Of course, the Rogers Pass Highway has a reputation of being deadly. There's been many fatal accidents on the highway over the years. The first fatal accident actually occurred a year before the highway was opened, when 2 men who were employed as truck drivers by McNamara Construction Company ran into a loaded gravel truck with their car. And Alan Wood, of 39 years old, of Sicamous, and Russell King, 41 years old, of Edmonton, both died. The accident occurred 44 miles east of Revelstoke. So part of the construction of the new highway, of course, was the construction of a new bridge at Revelstoke. At that time, the Big Bend Highway was part of the Big Bend Highway was the bridge across Revelstoke that had been built in 1924 and was still in use as the Big Eddy Bridge. But it was obvious that a new bridge was needed for the new highway. The bids for the bridge opened in May of 1958 and construction began that summer. Canada Engineering Corporation were the designers and supervisors of the bridge. On July 28, 1961, the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge was officially opened. Phil Gallardi, Minister of Highways, was the MC of the proceedings, conducted from a flatbed truck. Mayor Walter Hardman participated as well. Walter Hardman was mayor of Revelstoke for about 25 years, so he participated at a lot of events in the community. The Premier W.A.C. Bennett cut the ribbon, and he called on a couple of boys from the crowd to come and help him. So Glenn Piatelli and Brian Harrison helped him cut the ribbon. You can see there's a few recognizable people in the photograph as well. Just on the left, there's a man in a light colored coat and hat. That was Tangri Gallicano. So the suspension bridge, the 970-foot suspension bridge went immediately into service, and local motorists were trying it out well into the night. So there was pressure mounting for early opening of the Rogers Pass. There was pretty much every newspaper in the 1960s. There was somebody saying, we need to get this highway completed. It's late in It's taking longer than it was said it would take. We need to get it opened. There was a lot of call, especially by produce growers, for an opening of the highway. In April 5th of 1962, there was an article in the newspapers with the title, "Rogers Pass Will Stimulate Shipment of Strawberries." Previous to that, there in the early 1900s and up until the 20s and 30s and even into the 40s, Revelstoke was really known as a strawberry producing area, but that had kind of fallen by the wayside. But certainly by then, there was a lot of strawberry producers in Salmon Arm and other parts in the valley. So a man named O.H. Siverson, a Canadian fruit distributor, spoke to 40 growers at Salmon Arm. He pointed out that California strawberries had dominated the Western Prairie market, but added that there was still demand for good quality BC strawberries. Said that the present railway schedule made it hard for berries to get to Calgary without losing their freshness. At that point, the berries had to remain overnight in Revelstoke, spend all the next day on the train, and then wait in Calgary one more night before being distributed to the retailers the following morning. And said this way, with the transporting them directly over the Rogers Pass Highway, the berries could be shipped almost as soon as they are picked and would be distributed from Calgary the next morning. So the first shipment went over by a special permit in July of 1962, or July 12th, so just a little bit before the highway opened. The truckload of Salmon Arm strawberries, the truckers were allowed to use the pass for delivery, but they had to use the Big Bend Highway for the return trip. A.D. Booth, a Salmon Arms truck driver, took 264 crates of strawberries to Calgary in one trip and then made 2 further trips. He had permission to make 10 trips in total over what he called the spectacular new road, but described the return trip over the old Big Bend Highway as being very rough. So, that was in April. In May, the B.R. Stiles, the superintendent of Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks, received instructions to place an entrance gate at the west entrance of Glacier National Park, about 30 miles east of Revelstoke. Said after May 5th, travel will not be permitted beyond that point. The highway wasn't open through yet, but people were traveling on parts of the road, but they were going to restrict it until the highway was completed. There was also discussion about potential tolls on the road. There was no plans to put a toll in place, but at that time you had to pay a pass to drive through a national park. And so there were a lot of people were saying, well, that in essence is a toll, and it's making the Trans-Canada a toll road. So there was calls to not enforce the tolls for people just passing through. That didn't happen immediately, but in most cases now, people just driving through the national parks don't pay a park fee to go through unless they're stopping. But that was definitely a contentious issue at the time. There was a travel writer who had been able to go through the Rogers Pass in the end of June, or sorry, the end of July, and his name was Ken Liddell. He was quite a well-known Calgary Herald columnist, and he was eulogizing the Rogers Pass Highway and calling it a motorist's delight. Said that really one of the important aspects of the highway is that it was going to cut the distance from Calgary to Revelstoke from 359 miles down to 254 miles. The city of Revelstoke proclaimed a public holiday for July 30th, 1962, which was going to be the opening day of the highway, from 12 noon to 5:30, so that citizens could attend. And after that, the highway was staying open. Now, there were actually two openings of the highway. There was the one on July 30th that opened the highway through traffic. But then they did have a second federal celebration at Rogers Pass in September, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The July 30th, 1962 celebration, the paper announced that the road opens a new era for Revelstoke. They said that 3,827 automobiles between Revelstoke and the ribbon 8 miles east, and over 5,000 on the return trip. Honorable Philip A. Ghilardi, Minister of Highways for BC, presided over the ceremony. He referred specifically to the excellent cooperation of the federal officials and praised his own department for the excellent work the members of it had done. He referred to correspondence which showed that he had selected the route March 5th, 1956, and in a letter to the then Federal Minister of Public Works, had asked that the selection be incorporated in the Trans-Canada Agreement so that it was formally part of the Trans-Canada Highway. Mr. Ghilardi also declared, "There's been a lot of talk about who should get the credit. We are not interested in credit for anything other than we want the people of BC and of Canada to enjoy the highway through this God-given scenery. It's yours to enjoy. You paid for it. You take the credit for it," he told the crowd. Then after that, Premier W.A.C. Bennett and Mr. Taylor unveiled a cairn beside the highway to mark the official ceremony. And the cairn is still there. It's been moved to a slightly different location, but it still exists. The temperature at the site of the opening was 95 degrees, and 7 people actually fainted from the heat and were treated by first aid attendants. More than 150 newspaper, radio, and television men were there for the event. It was the largest local press representation since the 1939 royal visit. The newsmen complained that no provision had been made for their comfort, and they deplored the absence of press headquarters. After the opening, a giant barbecue was held at Mountain View and Joseph Hammond schools, and that's on 9th Street, the current location of Revelstoke Secondary School and Begbie Elementary Schools. They served 3,000 pounds of Alberta beef. There was a note in the newspaper saying some Valley newspapers said that only a part of the crowd was able to reach the barbecue stands. On the contrary, the servings went on well into the evening, and there was more than enough to go around. There was a quote from an American tourist. "This is the most successful affair I have ever attended. We couldn't match a picnic like this anywhere in the US. And such meat." There was a note in the paper, July 31st, 1962. It said 5,000 cars in jam as road open and 3 autos in crash after Rogers Pass ceremonies. It said many motorists waited 7 hours to make the trip. There was an accident 45 miles east with 3 cars in a rear end collision, but thankfully there were no injuries. It was announced on August 28, 1962, said Rogers Pass makes trucking history. Truck traveling with 38,000-pound shipment from Toronto to Vancouver. Gordon G. Dean of Winnipeg, President and General Manager of East West Transport Limited, which will carry the inaugural cargo, said the route will retain in Canada millions of dollars worth of business, which in the past was lost as a result of trucks using the United States routes. And it was announced that for the opening in September, the federal opening, that the Glacier Park fee would be waived that day with free entry into Glacier National Park for the federal opening. At the end of August of 1962, there was a 12-car motorcade that traveled from St. John's, Newfoundland to all the way across to Vancouver and Victoria. It took them 4 weeks to cross the country in their vehicles. And after they got to Victoria, they came back to Rogers Pass to take part in the ceremony. So the ceremony was, it was noted as not just the opening of the Rogers Pass Highway, but the official opening of the Trans-Canada Highway. The Big Bend Highway had been called part of the Trans-Canada, but it wasn't open year-round. So there wasn't a year-round, fully accessible Trans-Canada Highway until the Rogers Pass section opened in 1962. So they did a formal opening of the Trans-Canada Highway at Rogers Pass on September 3rd, 1962. There's the inside of the program and the program for the schedule of events for the day, for the afternoon. And of course, it ended with God Save the Queen, because Queen Elizabeth II was our reigning monarch at that time. There was a lot of preparation done for the ceremony, special signage put up at the time. And you can see they're preparing the podium with the provincial coats of arms. And lots of media coverage there. You can see all of the microphones set up. So on September 3rd, 1962, with about 3,000 people gathered, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker officially opened the Trans-Canada Highway. He tamped a 2-foot square of pavement into place, and you can see them preparing the spot there, and he's actually standing with the tamp in his hand, and wearing a workman's hard hat. He declared the Trans-Canada Highway officially open from coast to coast. The chairman of ceremonies was Edmund Davy Fulton, who was the Minister of Public Works for Canada, and he was the Member of Parliament from Kamloops. He described it as a $1 billion highway, said up to August, more than $700 million had been spent on construction, with the federal government share totaling $450 million. Another Member of Parliament, Stuart Fleming, said that the highway would restore Glacier National Park to its former glory, said already 347,000 people had entered the park in the 33 days since the road was opened. Prime Minister Diefenbaker noted that it was apt that the ceremony was taking place on Labor Day, and mentioned the thousands of workers, saying their toil made this day possible. He declared the highway open, saying, "May it serve to bring Canadians closer together, having now the means of knowing one another better than ever before. May this highway always serve the cause of peace, and may it never hear the marching tramp of warlike feet." The big marker that is still there with the arches was unveiled at that time, and a coat of arms of each province was unveiled by a representative from that province. And here, Minister of Highways, Phil Ghilardi, is unveiling the British Columbia plaque. Said for nearly 2 miles on either side of the summit, cars lined the edge of the highway for it to open again after the ceremony. It was closed for the 2 hours of the ceremony. And there's the CBC truck with the camera on the boom for the opening ceremony. Bagpiper at the opening ceremony. And if you look closely at the car there, it says Newfoundland on the side. So I am thinking that might have been one of the motorcade cars of the 12 vehicles that had crossed the country. And there's a picture of the crowds and the arch with the provincial crests and the special tent canopy set up with all of the provincial coats of arms on it, and John Diefenbaker at the podium. And somebody wrote a poem. Not a bad one. It's a nice little verse. Salute to the Rogers Pass. Once again the flags unfurled, fluttered, waved, pointed to the sky, as east met west in Rogers Pass, memories that will not die. Yes, we stood in wilderness, with snowy mountain peaks aloft, Easterners and Westerners similar in mien, mood, and thought. As we gazed toward the sky with not a cloud in view, with Mount Macdonald and Tupper pointing to the blue, there in splendor standing, our minds sensed they knew what the citizens' motives were and how alert to do. All provinces were represented by men so loyal and true. Yukon and Northwest Territories were remembered too. The challenge met, the shields unveiled, the ribbon cut, traffic uncurtailed. From Atlantic to Pacific, the asphalt race is won, road linked at last in Canada, where East and West are one. By Gwyneth H.R. Hanna. And to me, this is my favorite Rogers Pass photograph. There's the Yogi the Bear off there and the picnic basket on the table. Just quintessential Rogers Pass photograph. And there's a photograph of somebody stopping at right in front of the sign that says slide area do not stop, in a lovely Volkswagen Beetle taking a picture. And another 1960s postcard of the Rogers Pass Highway. This was the Northlander Lodge that was built at Rogers Pass in 1964 and was there until just a few years ago when it was torn down. The November 15th, 1962 newspaper noted that already over 500,000 passengers had traveled the Rogers Pass route. And just talk briefly about the impact on Revelstoke as well. This is the famous Wooden Head statue. And the Wooden Head was carved by local man Peter Fiocco during the construction of the Big Bend Highway. And it was placed at the boat encampment, which is at the top of the highway, before the top of the bend of the highway, and with a sign placed beside it saying, "Don't be wooden-headed. Drive carefully. You'll live to enjoy the scenery." So when the Rogers Pass Highway was opened, Wooden Head was moved down to Revelstoke. And here he is right at the little triangle at the junction coming into town. He was later moved over and is now in Wooden Head Park with a nice little shelter over him to protect him from the elements. But he's been a part of our highway history since 1940. You can see the road isn't even paved yet. This is they built Victoria Road right out to the junction. Victoria Road didn't extend that far at that time. So they had built it out. They created the underpass there under the railway tracks. And then this was within a couple of years, there was some service stations built at the junction. This is the Shell station, and at the right side of it was Pancake House. It was Smitty's and Scotty's at different times. That's where the Tim Hortons is now. And this is coming into Victoria Road, and this is the site of the current roundabout and the Nomad restaurant, just at the right, and not just that area where there's just where the gravel road going through there. It's where the Nomad would be. So there was an article in a Vancouver Province newspaper saying that there were, in 1962, saying there were no facilities at Rogers Pass, and that most of the communities were unprepared for the amount of traffic that was going to be coming through their communities. And specifically cited Revelstoke, saying there's really no good hotel facilities or motor hotel facilities here. The headline actually said, "BC naps in dirty house as tourists are rushing by." So locally, there started to be some new accommodation built. At that point, we had the Regent Hotel and the Revelstoke Hotel and the King Edward Hotel and several motor cabins as well, tourist cabins, but no sort of modern motels, motor inns. So McGregor's was the first one to be built between 2nd and 3rd Street, between Connaught and Campbell Avenues. And it opened in 1962. It's currently a Grizz Hotel. And then the Alpine Motel opened in 1963 and on Charles Street. And then there was Mount Rogers Motor Hotel opened right up on the highway before the bridge, be where the Sandman Inn is located now. It was fairly short-lived. It was opened in 1963 and was burned down in 1965. So that's the story of the Rogers Pass Highway. And in 2 weeks, on September 28th, we'll be talking about the West Highway to Sicamous, which opened 100 years ago. Thank you for coming today.